What makes some people crumble in the face of disaster while others find a way to push through? Psychologists call this trait quality resilience. And while it might sound like something you either have or don't, the truth is more complicated. Resilience doesn't always mean being fearless or unshakable. Sometimes it's a quiet persistence and a will not to give in or give up. Researcher George Bonanno, a professor of clinical psychology at the Teachers College at Columbia University, has been studying and mapping this trait out for more than 35 years.
We find most people are resilient to potentially traumatic events, but we've had a very difficult time until relatively recently making sense of that, understanding how we can determine who will be resilient and who not.
Bonanno is also the author of The End of Trauma: How the New Science of Resilience is Changing How We Think of PTSD.
We've measured many different factors. There's a kind of a common idea that there's 3 or 4 magic traits that resilient people have. And you see these sort of headlines, the 4 qualities of highly resilient people or whatever. But we've measured maybe, my team and other people, other researchers have measured 50, 60, 70 different factors. And we find many, many correlates of resilience. So lots of things correlate with resilience. There are lots of healthy things that we can assume would make us resilient.
For example, you might assume that people who are adaptable, flexible, and optimistic are likely to be more resilient than people who aren't. But Bonanno says these traits don't necessarily predict this. He calls this the resilience paradox.
We can measure all these things, but we still can't predict resilience. So that's led me and my team and other researchers also to develop an alternative way of thinking about these events that involves what I call flexibility, or regulatory flexibility, adaptive flexibility. We may have lots of positive characteristics, but every event is different. Every challenge, every life-threatening, highly aversive, disturbing event is different. It presents us with a different challenge. And so we have to adapt to that event. We have to figure out what's going to work in this situation. And, if you think about it, being in the pandemic, which we all went through recently, was a very different kind of challenge than, say, being in an automobile accident or being lost at sea.
Speaking of being lost at sea, in 1972, a British couple, Maurice and Marilyn Bailey, were in this exact position. They spent 4 months in a small rubber life raft on the Pacific Ocean after their sailboat sank. They ran out of food and fresh water after 20 days. So how did they manage to survive for 3 more months?
You press on, right? You meet crisis with pragmatism and with planning rather than with falling apart.
That's Sophie Elmhirst, journalist and author of A Marriage at Sea. It was during the pandemic that she came across this virtually forgotten story about the Baileys. She learned that out of the 2, Marilyn Bailey exhibited far more resilience than her husband, Maurice.
To be fair, in Maurice's mind as well, I think he was very quick, both publicly and privately, to sort of say that she kept them alive and that it was thanks to her that they survived. And that was her ingenuity, her pragmatism, her stoicism, but it was also her kind of almost arranged optimism, this sense that she just wasn't going to give up. She would just believe that they would survive, and she had all sorts of sort of strategies to retain that faith.
On the other hand, Maurice, like many of us, felt defeated and like all hope was lost.
I think that's absolutely fair to say that she did the hard job of survival for them both, really. She very quickly was like, right, we need projects, so they had 2 books that they got off their boat before it sank. She was like, right, we'll go through them line by line. We'll discuss every line. She knew it was very important that, there was a physical component like the fishing, in the water, but there was also this mental component. They needed to keep their minds busy. She had them playing cards that they made out of paper, dominoes that they made as well. And she was constantly planning. I think that was something that really struck me from her diary, that you see all these doodles and drawings of dresses she's designing and menus that she's planning and lists of elaborate sort of cakes and sandwiches and drinks and, picnics, occasions that, that she's sort of clearly, almost sort of salivating over in her mind. And partly that's probably due to starvation, but it's also I think is a kind of imaginative exercise of willpower.
Marilyn also jumped into action and adapted the few supplies they'd been able to save. For example, she salvaged a safety pin, bent it into a fishing hook, and was able to catch fish, and later sea turtles.
They would eat turtle eyeballs. They've discovered that there was sort of kind of a gooey kind of juice that came out of the eggs from turtles as well, sort of ways of trying to get other kinds of protein or moisture. Anyway, they were nothing if not like creative, I suppose, in how they found things to eat.
Several ships passed during the couple's 4-month-long ordeal in the small lifeboat. But apparently the people on board didn't see them and sailed right on by. When the 7th ship sailed out of view, Marilyn finally gave in to despair, but only briefly.
There are these brief moments, especially when a ship goes past and doesn't see them or the weather's really bad, when she'll write something like despair, depressed, no hope, or, it'll be a very brief. The next day, she's back into kind of documenting something or planning something or coming up with some new idea. So you feel like she allows them a very limited, literal amount of space on the page. And it's sort of, I feel like that corresponds to the amount of space she allowed them in her mind in a way.
Maurice freely admitted after they were finally rescued by a Korean fishing ship that he would have never survived had it not been for his partner's ingenuity and optimism. Maybe it was experience that allowed Marilyn to keep calm, regulate her emotions, and adapt to the situation. Traits that Bonanno points to as the core of resilience.
The whole process of development is about learning how we regulate ourselves. And it actually maps very nicely onto this concept of flexibility. And most people actually at least moderate skill in these different flexibility components and working out, how do I respond to this situation? That said, I think it's very much ripe for people to get better at these skills, to improve in these skills. And I'm doing a lot of research on that right now, on whether we can train people, how we can train people to be more flexible, to better use these skills. It's a very natural human trait already. We are very flexible. We have very flexible brains, but it is how we learn, how we behave in the world. And it really helps us to understand that and perhaps try to do that more effectively.
Bonanno believes we can build resilience early on by introducing kids to challenging events or tasks and allowing them to fail. We learn through our mistakes, and it's in the challenges that we grow. Sophie Elmhirst's book, A Marriage at Sea, and George Bonanno's book, The End of Trauma, How the New Science of Resilience is Changing How We Think of PTSD, are available now online and can be requested through your local bookstore. To find out more about our guests this week, visit viewpointsradio.org. This story was written and produced by Polly Hansen. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. Our studio manager is Jason Dickey. I'm Marty Peterson. This segment is brought to you by Capital One. Banking with Capital One helps you keep more money in your wallet with no fees or minimums on checking accounts and no overdraft fees. What's in your wallet? Terms apply. See CapitalOne.com/bank for details. Capital One, N.A., member FDIC.